There's big news in 3 arenas where the United States is applying maximum pressure. Are these policies finally delivering results? Could there actually be a deal with Iran? And Cuba is feeling the pain of racing toward radical economic reforms. And in Venezuela, a major win for the good guys. I'll begin with the big one, our war with Iran. After a couple of days of waves of military strikes against defensive positions and other IRGC assets, and after abruptly calling off a third day of strikes, President Trump has announced that a deal with Iran has been reached. The deal is actually a Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, a temporary framework to immediately end the fighting and establish a 60-day window for technical discussions to finalize a permanent treaty. Yeah, I know. We've been close a dozen times before. If you saw my last video on the subject, you know that I expressed strong skepticism about the possibility of any enforceable deal ever being reached with the Iranian regime. Frankly, I remain dubious. But there are new reasons for optimism this time. For one, the Iranian government has acknowledged the news of the agreement and that the fate of the nuclear material in their possession is being discussed. The United States' position had been that all of the nuclear dust be removed and destroyed, but it appears that the current framework provides for it to be diluted to a low grade but kept in country. This is still an important pivot in the Iranian position. As far as I know, this is the first time that the nuclear material issue has even been acknowledged publicly by the government in Tehran in the current conflict. Another interesting development is that there are large protests in Tehran, Mashhad, and Qom organized by hardliners chanting "Death to the Compromisers" and demanding the resignation of Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. The protesters say that the agreement is invalid if it doesn't have public approval directly from the Supreme Leader, Mojtaba Khamenei. So, what is my take on all this? What I see as a new development is the possible existence of some level of pragmatism within the Islamist government that we haven't seen before. Let me explain. Despite what any naysaying nabobs might want to tell you, the IRGC has seriously been downgraded as a military threat to the region. Also, the blockade of Iranian ports is having an enormously negative impact on their economy. And while the Revolutionary Guard still maintains some offensive military capability, they don't have much, if any, defense against airstrikes and missile attacks. The latest round of attacks by the U.S. showed that Trump was willing to go back to the full-scale military offensive when the negotiations yielded no progress. So maybe someone in the Islamist government finally realized that they cannot defeat the American military or overcome the blockade. If the ultimate goal is to stay in power, which has always seemed to be their main objective, then maybe they recognize that some kind of deal had to be worked out. My other takeaway has to do with the survivability of this agreement. I say this for a couple of reasons. One has to do with the protests by the hardliners against their own government. The question that keeps nagging at me is simple. How much authority do the negotiators actually have to represent the country? We have always heard about the deep divisions within the IRGC, but we haven't been able to see it up close. The infighting still makes me wonder about the level of resistance there is going to be within the Revolutionary Guard to any accommodation with the United States at all. If the intransigent elements of the Guard refuse to cooperate, is it possible that we may see an actual civil war break out within the IRGC? If the Supreme Leader really is in favor of this compromise, then will we see the most radical elements of the IRGC submit to his authority? My other concern has to do with the still unresolved gaps in the demands by both sides that are yet to be negotiated and the reliability of the Iranian government to negotiate them in good faith. Both sides have their own spin on what the agreement actually means. And it must be recognized that this could just be part of Iran's ongoing efforts to stall and buy even more time to recover and regroup. But in any case, I see the overt fighting by distinct elements of the Revolutionary Guard as a strange kind of progress, Like I said, it could at least resolve the ambiguity of who rules in that country. Honestly, I suspect that this story may change at least once before the MOU is actually signed. We'll see what develops. Now, on to Cuba. The government of President Miguel Díaz-Canel has announced some sweeping reforms to their economic system. Basically, the idea is to emulate the policies of communist nations like China and Vietnam. This is an effort to overcome the maximum pressure campaign by the United States and to find a way for the government to remain in power. Cuba, along with North Korea, is one of the last countries in the world to embrace the concept of central economic planning. You know, the Chinese Communist Party doesn't even call their system communism anymore. They call it socialism with Chinese characteristics. But what it really is capitalism with Chinese repression. That is what the government in Havana is shooting for. The United States has explicitly expressed its intention to maintain the policy of maximum pressure despite the relief that the stated reforms could have to alleviate the real suffering of the Cuban population. For my part, I agree with our government's position. It's high time for the people of Cuba to be liberated. There is something wrong with a regime that can't tolerate any criticism or dissonance from its population and that completely restricts the free flow of information. Also, I believe that it's an issue of national security. China would certainly make good use of a stronger and wealthier Cuba, and we don't need that on our doorstep at this critical time in history. Well, that is my take anyway. So, what's going on in Venezuela? In an unprecedented joint military operation, the United States and Venezuelan forces collaborated to eliminate the capo of the Tren de Aragua criminal organization, Héctor El Niño Guerrero. This is notable for several reasons. For one, it is the first time our government has used its anti-terrorist policy to eliminate the leader of a multinational cartel. I have to wonder what the reaction will be in Mexico, not to mention Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. There hasn't been any public comment from the Mexican government, but there's no doubt that it raised eyebrows in certain circles. Also, even though the operation was labeled as a joint effort, I seriously doubt that the idea originated from the Venezuelan side. This shows the continuing influence and power the U.S. government maintains over that country. Many high government officials, most notably former Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino and current Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello, allegedly had strong ties to Guerrero and the Tren de Aragua organization. I think that it's an indication of their declining influence in Venezuela. And it's a fair bet that neither of them would have been given a heads up on the operation, so hopefully they're feeling the heat. The stated goal of the United States for Venezuela and for Cuba is to eventually have free and fair elections in both countries. In Venezuela, the power the United States wields is palpable, as evidenced by Venezuelan collaboration with the U.S. military in the elimination of El Niño Guerrero. Cuba still flatly rejects the idea of popular elections and insists on one-party communist rule. But clearly, the reforms proposed by Díaz-Canel are a direct consequence of the maximum pressure campaign by the Trump administration. Donald Trump still cannot claim ultimate victory in any of these three countries. It is my opinion that his historical legacy depends greatly on the outcome of these specific examples, especially Iran. Ultimately, his legacy may depend on whether these pressure campaigns produce lasting political change in the Middle East and in the Americas. In spite of some trepidation, I remain cautiously optimistic. This is Pablo El Molinero. If you found this video interesting or compelling, please consider sharing it with your friends. Also, give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. It would really help us out.